Welcome, everybody. Today we have Associate Professor Tyler Fett from the University of Utah speaking to us today about rethinking the ecological drivers of hominin evolution. Tyler, how long is your talk? About 30 minutes?
I'm going to aim for 30 and maybe we can talk afterwards.
Perfect, because that's what I was going to say. Hope for about 30 minutes from you. You can answer any pertinent questions from that. And then I prepared a couple of breakout rooms, which we can then join around specific themes of the project. And so that will probably take us to about 5 o'clock, possibly a bit later, depending on how that goes. So yes, thank you so much for speaking today, Tyler, and the floor is all yours.
All right, thanks very much, Lynn, and thanks everyone for showing up. Glad I got my technology situation sorted here. I'm glad to have this opportunity to talk about this sort of as this project is coming together. Hopefully there will be some relevant pieces here. But what I'm talking about today is sort of a conceptual piece of work, which we can circulate. It's published a couple months ago. But this is part of a collaborative effort, so I just want to acknowledge like the dozens of hours I spent on the phone with Andrew Dew and lots of Zoom meetings with my other colleagues, Kay, Ben, John, David, and Bernard. And the project was motivated by this. This is it was a commentary paper published in Nature by Andrew Hill in 1981. For the record, that's, I was not even a twinkle in my dad's eye at that time. So this is a long time ago. He was sort of complaining. It was after a workshop. It was a critical commentary about a workshop held in France, I believe, saying that paleoecologists and those interested in ecology and its relevance to human evolution, we need to stop sheltering behind the need behind acquiring more data. We need to think about what our questions are. And so he accused the field of being in this data-driven, we just need more data situation. And that was, 1981. So we're talking 40 years ago now. But hey, decades later, and the mantra is more and better data. If only we could get higher resolution sequences, if we could get, different data types that have been hard to get at. Eventually, maybe the answers are going to just start falling out of the sky. So certainly the National Research Council report from the U.S. National Academy of Sciences sort of was launched at about the same time as the hominin sites and Paleo Lakes drilling project, which has generated some fantastic empirical archives and continues to. So we are sitting on, fantastic data sets, especially compared to what we had access to back when Andrew Hill was writing in 1981. But at the same time, I think people are kind of coming around to the idea that more data hasn't led to the answers. Curtis Marion published a critical paper a few years ago, sort of criticizing what we do with the data and outlining one way of maybe going about it. And I think this is an important piece of work getting us to think, beyond just if only we had more and better data, but how can we use the data more effectively? And hopefully some of what I have to say here is going to be relevant to us and our project as we move forward. So I'm going to talk about 3 things that I think have been sort of obstacles to a deep, obtaining a deeper understanding of relationships between climate, environment, and various aspects of human, behavioral or morphological or macroevolutionary change. What are the obstacles and how can we get around these? The good news is I think it's fairly straightforward to get around them. We just need to think more critically about our approach. And I'll begin with the fossil record, which is oftentimes woefully incomplete. Everything we know and about human behavior, human evolution, outside genetic evidence is pretty much constrained by the fossil and archaeological record and what that record looks like. And basically it constrains everything that we can know. And we can either accept it or just live in denial. And if we're looking at the fossil record of, say, earlier hominins, say prior to Homo sapiens, this is you can pull any number of maps like this one off of Google showing a handful of key hominin fossil localities. Excuse me, this spans, the last 6 million years or so. And the spatial extent is very limited relative to, say, the geographic range of a given hominin, especially if we zero in at any given time slice. Well, sorry, my computer's finally fine, but now I've got like a frog in my throat. I can't talk. More coffee. Always got to be a problem on these Zoom things. Anyhow, I think I can talk now. So what we do know, we need fossils that are actually preserved. So hominins have to be living in a place, doing stuff, dying in a place where that is conducive to preservation of their remains. Those remains then have to be exposed in a way where we can find them, typically. And people have to do the field work. It's fine if we satisfy the first few criteria, but unless someone's out there doing the work, it's not going to happen. And there are certain places that are off limits to work. And most people tend to do field work where other people have been finding stuff, because we know that we can continue to find stuff. And certainly for the earlier record, it's a tiny little piece of Africa that satisfies these different requirements. And the outcome of all that is that our behavioral and fossil record is really gappy. We have these little windows that are on and off at different time periods. And so this gives us spatial gaps in the fossil record. We're not capturing all the places where certain hominins were. And we have temporal gaps. We have gaps in time where we just don't know what's going on for a given species or a given technology. And just to walk through this figure from on the left, from bottom to top, we have a hominin originating, and its range is shifting in very dramatic and probably unrealistic ways across Africa. And we have different fossil sites that are little windows to the past, but they're not always on. They're not always preserving fossils at a given time. And certainly that's the case with most fossil localities. We don't have complete records of all time periods. And so it's only the fossil sites in green that are actually capturing fossils. And the outcome then is, if we look at the actual range of, say, this hypothetical hominin across South, East, Central, and Northern Africa, we can compare that to the observed range. Our temporal windows, or our observed temporal extent of the fossil record is very limited compared to reality. And the same is true of its spatial extent. We're not capturing the whole range of these species. And because of that, and this leads to, we have incomplete sampling of typically rare species. And that means the goalposts are constantly changing for various evolutionary and behavioral milestones. You follow the high profile papers over the years, and it's a new earlier date for this technology, a new earlier date for this species. And just to give an example, if we look at Homo sapiens, us, over the decades, the oldest fossil material belonging to us, we can maybe start in Clossey's River, thought to date to the last interglacial in the early 80s, and it still does date to the last interglacial, but that was sort of among the clearest old examples of our species. Fast forward to 2003, now our first appearance is in Herto in Ethiopia at 160,000. A few years later, the Kibish stuff is redated to 200,000, and presently, but probably not forever, Jebel Irhoud, has the crown as the oldest Homo sapiens at about 300,000 years. And you look at this history, and this is true for all species, it's true for archaeological techno-complexes. It would seem very silly if we were going to spend a lot of effort trying to explain what wonderful things were happening in South Africa 100,000 years ago to give rise to our species, or in 2003, what wonderful things were happening in Ethiopia to give rise to our species. The goalposts are constantly changing. But anyhow, there's a lot of origins literature that often ignores the realities of the data, and we just plow ahead. A classic example is origins of Homo, which has inspired decades of speculation and research, sort of trying to link the emergence of our genus to climatic environmental change. And yet we have very limited understanding of when this is happening, let alone where. I mean, our assumption has to be that our observed first appearances of the genus are actually tracking its emergence and not just dispersal from somewhere else where we don't have a good fossil record. So what do we do about it? All right, it's easy for Tyler to sit up and complain, but what do? We can ask questions and use analytical frameworks that acknowledge the uncertainties and the realities of the fossil record. And that means asking questions that are answerable and using frameworks that take into account some of these spatial and temporal gaps. There's a long tradition of doing this in paleobiology. This is just a handful of papers over the decades, looking at, how do we place confidence intervals on stratigraphic ranges? How can we identify mass extinction events or turnover pulses in the fossil record when we have this very spotty record? there's a lot of approaches for doing this. They haven't always been applied to paleoanthropological context, but there's some promising recent steps. This paper was published I think over the summer, at least for those of us in the Northern Hemisphere, placing confidence intervals on some of the key stone technologies in Africa, the Acheulean and the Oldowan, showing, hey, here's what we observe, but it's very likely that these technologies are emerging much earlier than what we actually have observed. There's lots of ways of going about it, but I think this is a promising first step. So I think important to keep in mind, where our data come from and what they actually look like when we're trying to explain aspects of human evolution. The second big issue I want to bring up is scale, and specifically spatial and temporal scale, and making sure that the scales of our questions and the data are overlapping. And I'll just give you an example of some work that's relevant here. The Acheulean to Middle Stone Age transition. This is an archaeological shift documented in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago. At least at the moment, it seems to roughly correspond in time with the emergence of our species Homo sapiens. Who knows if that's how long that's gonna last? I don't know. A review paper written eight or 9 years ago would have said, looks like earliest Middle Stone Age is associated with other species. Our picture is constantly changing. But this is a big technological shift, characterized by these big hand axes, for those of you unfamiliar, to Middle Stone Age technology, where we've got lots of bifacial points, prepared core technology and the like, and sort of a beginning of this behavioral repertoire that begins to look a lot more human. And it's captured people's attention, and we want to know, why did it happen? What's going on here? What causes the Acheulean, the longest lived technology in Africa, to suddenly shift? And there's been a lot of work exploring that. Here's one piece of work published a couple of years ago, who presented a really cool terrestrial environmental sequence from Olorgesailie in southern Kenya Rift. And that environmental sequence led to the conclusion that the time period during which the Acheulean is being replaced by Middle Stone Age is characterized by tremendous environmental variability, a lot of rapid change on the landscape. And so the argument here is perhaps the onset of the Middle Stone Age is driven by environmental variability. Okay, well, shortly thereafter, another research group, actually with a lot of the same people involved, presented a lake core record from Lake Magadi, not far, hour-and-a-half drive from Olorgesailie. It's been a while since I've done that drive, so I may be off the mark, but it's close. And their records, this is a different basin capturing slightly different environmental patterns, because each of these different basins, especially in East Africa, is very sensitive to its own tectonic and sort of local climatic drivers.
I'm very good. How are you?
And the Magadi records suggest that, well, maybe the onset of the Middle Stone Age is associated with and perhaps driven by aridity. So you got these two different ideas. No, it's variability. No, it's aridity, coming from two different records. And here's a picture from central Utah. Those two records, really, they're trees in the forest. Lake Magadi's a pinyon and Olorgesailie is an aspen. The spatial scale of observation from a single sort of relatively restricted basin scale observation is too small for the question. The Acheulean to Middle Stone Age transition is documented across Africa. It's a large scale technological shift. We're going to have a hard time trying to understand what really precipitated it, focusing on a few little points in the landscape. I mean, who knows what would have happened if we had, if we looked at Southern Africa or different parts of Southern Africa, we might get very different interpretations. So I think explaining this technological transition is going to require a much larger lens than what's going on here at my site. And this is important. I think, ecologists, this is well documented in ecology, evolutionary biology, ecological as well as evolutionary pattern and process vary across spatial and temporal scales. And just, why is that important? Just to give you an example. So here I've got some lions and some zebra. If we were to follow this herd of zebra around on a grassy floodplain for a few days, we would probably observe that they tend to avoid places frequented by lions for obvious reasons. And so at that very, small scale observation, following this one herd and this one grassy floodplain, the conclusion would be zebras and lions, they don't like each other. They are spatially segregated on the landscape. Cool. What if we change our scale of observation? Well, let's look at Sub-Saharan Africa. And these are some recent range maps for plain zebra and lions. There would be a lot more overlap probably 100 years ago. But if you start looking at this, you'd say, well, wait a second, maybe at this scale, zebras and lions are overlapping. They seem to co-occur in a lot of the same spots. And if we look at protected areas across much of Sub-Saharan Africa, we find zebras and lions in many of the same places. So at a different spatial scale here, our interpretation of the pattern, the ecological pattern here, completely reverses. And ecologists have paid attention to this for forever, and they accept there's no correct scale of observation. What matters here is that we make sure that the scales of the questions are aligned with the scales of the data that we use to answer those questions. So if we have large-scale questions about human evolution, how did global climate change shape macroevolutionary trends in the hominin clade? We probably need continental to global scale records. If we want to know, what is going on in the habitat preferences of a single hominin species at a single place, well, we need local scale records to get at that. And our data, the great thing about paleo data is that, many times the same kind of places can give us data that speak to a whole range of spatial and temporal scales. And, all we need to do is start making sure that we're using the right data sets to answer our questions. So what can we do about it? I think one, be cognizant of scale and ensure that we're aligning the scales of the question with the data. But I think it also forces us to really think more about what are the scales of our data? How well do we understand the data that we're actually working with? And I think in many cases, there's a lot of room for exciting progress, which is great. And just to give you an example of why I think this stuff is important, my colleagues Andrew Dew and Kay Berensmeyer did some fun analyses. Kay has been spending decades surveying large mammal recent vertebrate remains in Amboseli Park in Kenya. And using this modern landscape bone assemblage, they looked at how various scaling effects within that data set. But one interesting takeaway that's certainly relevant here is they were able to sort of estimate how time averaging is sort of equivalent to spatial averaging. And they are. If we have a time average fossil assemblage that samples more and more time, it is equivalent to sampling more and more space. I can sit out and look out my window here, and if I sit long enough, I will see all kinds of, I'm looking at a mountain, I will see deer, I will see foxes, I will see various squirrels and the like. Sitting around for a long time is one way of finding them, or I can get on the move and just start hiking into the mountains. I will also find them. Time averaging, spatial averaging, they're very similar. And in Amboseli, their data suggested, hey, if we time average this bone assemblage by about 1,000 years, that's equivalent to sampling about 70 square kilometers. If we time averaged it by about 10,000 years, now we're talking 700 square kilometers, and 100,000 years of time averaging, which is not out of the ballpark, especially if we're looking at Pliocene and early Pleistocene bone assemblages. That's looking at 7,000 square kilometers. The spatial scale of a very time averaged faunal data set is huge. And yet I certainly haven't always thought about that when thinking about what does the environmental context look like if we're going, looking at the environment through time in a bone assemblage. And finally, and I think maybe what we might set the stage for some more discussion here, how we go about building stronger inferences in paleoanthropology. Typically, this is sort of the MO for a lot of hominin paleoecology research, but we focus on reconstructing the paleo environment at a given site, at a depositional basin, or maybe a broader region, depending, and the environmental data just depends on what we do. I work on large mammal fauna, some people are geochemists, some people are going to look at pollen, but we reconstruct the environment. Or maybe we assemble different data sets and put them together, and we start looking for patterns in the empirical data. What are the main patterns in my environmental data set? And then we start looking at patterns in hominin evolution, extinction and speciation events, technological transitions. We start lining them up and inferring causal relationships about how the environment may have influenced some evolutionary milestone in our own hominin prehistory. And this is a, we're going from data to an explanation, and that is a post hoc explanation designed to explain the data. They're not inherently bad, especially if we're working with systems about which we don't have a good handle on what's going on. But when we're dealing with noisy data, like the hominin fossil record, which is noisy as in, imprecision in terms of our dating, we have all these spatial and temporal gaps to contend with. Any number of post hoc explanations can then be created to explain the data. It's easy to sort of weave some narrative through the data to explain it. And the outcome of that is this endless buffet of hypotheses that are consistent with the data, because they've been designed to explain the data, and that can't be readily discerned from one another, because they've all been, those hypotheses have been sort of packaged to be correct. And obviously that's a bit of a challenge for trying to really get at robust inferences about what are the key climatic and environmental shifts that have influenced our evolutionary history. I think we need a bit more of inference that goes in the other direction, where we're starting with hypotheses or proposed explanation for how a system works, and then testing it with the data. And if we use frameworks to generate precise predictions that are tested with the data, we can then see, if our hypotheses are right. Do they need to be modified? Do they need to be rejected? And I think a more healthy balance between inductive and deductive inference would be hopeful. So where do those predictions come from? It comes from theory. And by theory, I just mean a proposed description of how a natural or cultural system works. It's our notion of how the system is supposed to play out. And without theory and the models that arise from them, we have no prediction. And so what am I talking about here? Well, archaeologists often use models derived from behavioral ecology. Certainly that's very big among my colleagues here at the University of Utah. Behavioral ecology, for decades, archaeologists have been taking models informed by behavioral ecology and figuring out how to operationalize them to test hypotheses using archaeological data, whether it's lithic data, aspects of stone tool technology, or faunal data, how people are foraging on the landscape. And behavioral ecology, people use it because it generates predictions that we can then test with our data sets. For other kinds of questions, let's say macroevolutionary patterns, verbose turnover pulse has been the focus of attention for decades. Now, many people often associate turnover pulse hypothesis with onset of the Pleistocene, emergence of the genus Homo and Paranthropus, but which is correct. She applied it in that context. But more broadly, turnover pulse hypothesis is a model of how climate change drives speciation and extinction. And it leads to very clear predictions. And I think this is one reason why paleontologists have been writing about it for so long, is it's one of the few theoretical frameworks we have to grasp from that really outline the turnover pulse hypothesis. If you get into that literature, it has very robust theoretical underpinnings that really clearly outline, how we get from climate to macroevolutionary change and what we might expect to see in the fossil record. And we don't have a lot of that. So we, focus on turnover pulse hypothesis as sort of a key model of how climate change can drive evolutionary change. There are other, these are just two examples. There's lots of places we can draw from. What can we do about it? So I think, drawing from existing theoretical frameworks that account for the evolutionary phenomena we want to explain, or we may need to do, pay attention to theoretical development, developing new models for how we think certain systems work. And we certainly have new tools for going about this. This came about both in my paper. It was also a focus of Curtis Marion's evolutionary anthropology paper that I cited earlier, but an obstacle to getting from prediction to empirical test is our data are, we have these time averaged archaeological, paleontological, paleoenvironmental data sets. And so sometimes it's kind of hard to figure out, well, what should we actually see in this data? How can we test it? Generative modeling, which includes agent-based modeling, is one way of going about it. But we start with theory and build a model that simulates how we think the system should be working. And we can produce simulated outcomes under different contexts, and then evaluate with empirical data and see, are we on the right page? We can that's one way of sort of operationalizing theoretical frameworks to make a bit of progress. And just to give you a more concrete example, my colleague Ben Davies, who's involved in this paper and helped put together this figure here, we're going through right now and simulating zebra tooth fossil assemblages. We're growing zebra teeth under different environmental regimes. They are uptaking, tooth growth is complicated, so we got to take that into account. They're drinking water from different sources in different rainfall regimes, and that they are being born and dying at different times of the year. And the question is like, what are, if we were to serially sample these teeth for say delta 13C or delta 18O, what are our expected patterns under different environmental configurations? It's really complicated. For those people who get into serial sampling of isotopes, the ideal theoretical model is a nice little sine curve like this, as the isotopic signal changes in response to seasonal changes in rainfall, for example. But reality, it's the data are much more noisy. And so we can use these kind of simulations to generate predictions. Here's what we think our data should look like under different environmental configurations. We can then start taking our empirical data and evaluating. I think overall, confronting some of these obstacles, again, all of the three obstacles that I've outlined here, the incompleteness of the fossil and archaeological record, the issue of understanding and aligning the scales of our data and using theory, they're all surmountable. And really, I think we can view it as an opportunity to push ahead, as opposed to just focusing on more and better data. There are tools out there to put our data to work for us. Some of the problems I'd like to see addressed in the future, maybe not in this working group necessarily, but more broadly, what is the uncertainty surrounding the timing, spatial distribution of evolutionary milestones we wish to explain? There's certain key events in our evolutionary history that have captured our attention. And I think we need to understand, well, what is the uncertainty about that? Is this a tractable question? Trying to explain it. What are the spatial and temporal scales of our paleo proxies? Some paleo proxies, we got a really good handle on things. Others, I think we've got room for improvement. And by improvement, I mean open research opportunities to really start sorting this out. And more broadly, how can we more effectively synthesize individual paleoenvironmental records derived from different proxies with uneven sampling effort through time and space? And just to give you an example, I've been working with some colleagues in Eastern Africa on the Eastern African Paleosol geochemical record. And we got several millions of years of Paleosol carbonate data informing on, say, vegetation changes. We're looking at stable carbon isotopes. But that Eastern African record is made up of individual records from different basins that have their own environmental histories, and sometimes they're flicking in and out. And it turns out to be enormously complicated trying to actually disentangle, like, what is the regional pattern here, as opposed to what is a shift in that record that's just related to a new basin sort of coming online where we have new data. There's a lot of work to be done there. And how can we develop a more robust body of theory to understand hominin evolution? We need predictions, as opposed to looking at our data and trying to tell a compelling narrative about it. What are our predictions? And I guess more relevant here, and hopefully I've gone fast enough that we have, yes, I think I did keep it at about 30 minutes. For this working group in particular, what are our questions? What are our predictions? And that dictates the data requirements. And I think that's, I think something we're thinking about here to avoid the trap of, just synthesizing lots of data. We have it. There are great data sets out there, and looking for patterns and seeing, what can we say about this? But if we start thinking, well, we know what data are out there, but what are the questions? What are our predictions? What do we expect to see? What data do we need to pull together to actually do this? I think there's a lot of exciting opportunities here. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit that's just been left there because the focus for decades has just been, let's generate more and better data. But I think we're kind of poised at this exciting time to start putting it to use. So that's all I got today. I think this paper has been posted to our Slack webpage, but here it is if you want to read it in more detail. I acknowledge Andrew Hill once again. He was complaining about some of the stuff in 1981, but I've had lot of gin and tonics with him. This is probably 10 years ago now, but talking about some of these same kind of issues. And acknowledge the NSF for some support. But otherwise, I think we're open for questions, and I don't think anyone needs to see my slides. There's no data here. I think we can just talk.
Thanks so much, Tyler. That was great. Questions? Anybody with a burning question or any question?
What were you hitting the keyboard with to change the slides? Was it a hammer or just your fist?
you don't type like this?
He's very passionate.
Yes, as a man on a mission.
I can't hear that when I'm wearing my headset. You know, now I don't know what to do. Self-conscious if I'm using the keyboard, wearing the headset.
I blame
Brian,
myself.
you're not giving me any options.
I blame myself.
I do too.
Just if I do a comment, I think the spatial question is interesting in terms of you have a site, you've gone and you've gotten your speleothem, your lake or whatever, I think, you know, often the hope is that this will solve the world's problems in some way or another. And you sort of hear a lot, I'm not just in this group, but sort of generally, it's like, oh, this record, it represents African climate change in some way, which is sort of a fundamentally ridiculous statement, considering the heterogeneity of Africa as a massive continent. But we sort of tend to lead into that direction. And I just know that from, you know, Southern Africa, as we get more and more data from a marked paucity thereof, that the results in that regard have been really interesting. We've got, you know, 900 kilometers along a transect of the Namib Desert that is basically doing the same thing at sites along the transect over the last 50,000 years. The signals are remarkably similar. And then there are other places where literally you go over a mountain range, 50 kilometers away, and you have a completely inverted signal. And to establish the significance, spatial significance of your record, it can be tricky. Sometimes you need to have more data to assess it properly. Not to detract from the basic point of, okay, we've got a lot of data, let's try to find some different ways to use it. But I think equally we do need to be careful in that regard and be circumspect in the way we compile the data and the way we consider it. So, more of a comment.
You only capture like that spatial heterogeneity once you have more, no.
That's kind of it, or at least that's, I mean, that's my personal experience. Is, you know, we've had expectations and we wrote up some papers, and then kind of sat on the other data for a while because we picked up something in between where it's like, oh, fucking hell, that's not it. Oh my God, this, you know. So there's a.
But yeah, I mean, it's not to, you know, the empirical data collection is so key, and I don't want to diminish that stuff at all, but it really is, you know, I think there's always the temptation to, as you said, you know, this is Africa. We want to do the big things, but, you know, a local scale record, which we, you know, that's the foundation of all our knowledge. We've got lots of local records that we can start putting together. You know, that record will probably tell us about, you know, ecological evolutionary changes at that local scale, which is fine as long as we sort of keep grounded on that and not thinking that this actually reflects all of Southern Africa or, you know, all of Eastern Africa or all of Africa as a whole. So, you know, it's sort of, well, what questions can we ask with what kind of data sets?
Yeah. And I think, you know, through this exercise, I think that is something that we can maybe achieve with a greater degree of objectivity and clarity. It's very often, you know, my experience is a paper is published and you almost need to sort of strip away the marketing layers that have been put on it to try to get it as high as it can fly on the echelon of journals and go back to sort of the brass tacks and figure out, okay, well, the suggestion is that this solves all the world's problems. But let's look at this a bit more critically and see what it might actually be telling us.
Vincent, would you like to ask a question? You did want to before, but maybe not anymore. Oh, there we go.
I'm in bed, so I'm not going to put on my video. Hi, Tyler. Thanks. That was a lot to think about. Thank you very, very much. Delta 13C is a very good one, I think, because a lot of the kind of uniformitarian example, sort of background is and the assumptions in the modern context are not applicable in paleo contexts necessarily. So yeah, I'd really encourage you to look at that, and you know, looking for a mechanistic framework is very important. And of course, we have for Delta 13C a theory from Farquhar, von Kammerer, and Berry going back 30 years. That theory is that the common equation for that is an approximation to a much longer equation. All sorts of other things are going on, which actually means that this assumption that Delta 13C is related to mean annual precipitation is incorrect. And in fact, if you have a look at, if you go and take an average tree, you will find that sometimes you'll get a completely different response from the predicted CICA response in terms of Delta 13C. There's a lot more going on at the local level, in other words, which goes to what you're saying about getting the context and the scale correct. So absolutely. My own feeling is actually, there's very good evidence to show that the relationship with precipitation is very, very weak indeed. It might apply to very, very high or very, very low numbers, Delta 13C, but it's certainly in the middle range. It could be 100 millimeters per year, or it could be 1,000. However, there's much more to it. And in terms of C3 biomes, I think using it for other things is much more valuable potentially. Other variables which have a direct mechanistic effect on plant isotope fractionation and so forth. So I really, yeah, I encourage you to go down that rabbit hole, and yeah, great. That's what I wanted to say.
That's another, I mean, the fun thing about that scale problem is, you know, if we're looking at particular relationships between an isotopic system and, you know, some aspect of climate, you know, if we look, hey, I pulled global data, and this is what the global relationship looks like between whatever my isotope system is and whatever climate parameter I'm interested in, you're going to get a global scale pattern. But you know, does that global scale pattern apply, you know, on the southern coast of South Africa? I don't know. Or does the pattern that we make ground truth in the present day on the south coast of South Africa, can you extrapolate that to larger scales? Maybe not. And you know, that goes back to that ecological pattern and process. Well, it depends on the scales that we're looking at. An archaeological example, this is something that Justin and Brian Stewart and I were talking about just the other week, is, you know, our ideas about human mobility and how they're moving across the landscape in relation to environment is based on global scale data sets. You know, these ethnographic compilations across the globe. And we got into discussing, well, is that how it works at a small scale? You know, is this global scale pattern of how climate and seasonality mediates human behavior? Is that applicable at my one cave?
Yeah, it's such an important question to ask, and it's a difficult one to know what to sort of what to assume, and yeah.
Question from Justin. I think he had his hand up for quite a while there.
Yeah, fortunately with the digital hands, it's not a pain in the butt, right, to just hang around. Thanks, Tyler. I obviously am a fan of this sort of like theory first approach, kind coming from the archaeological record where theory is a big deal for us. But I had a question, given you're thinking deeply on that connection between the units of analysis and the theory that we use. Yeah, I'm wondering, do the units of analysis that have been proposed for at least the cultural components of these models align with the theoretical approaches that you think are most important for moving these relationships forward? So behavioral ecology or other systems-based approaches. Do units of analysis like Middle Stone Age, Later Stone Age, Acheulean, Older One, do they actually align up with that theory? Or are we in the position where we actually need new units of analysis? And if that's
or
the
new
case,
theory.
or new theory, but because I kind of agree, I think theory is probably the thing that we can, build from existing points of perspective a little bit easier than we can the units of analysis that are currently used in a lot of the arguments. And with the faunal data, the second part of the question is, do we then need to go and revisit the data that we have, in the sense that with fauna, the data have been collected largely with ecological goals in mind. What does this tell us about environments? What does this tell us about population structure and change? But the cultural data were never generated that way. They were generated to look at culture history questions, right? So how do people move through landscapes? How do we test for diffusion and migration? These are not ecological questions. And so their data were driven by a completely different set of theoretical parameters, often very nationalistic, very individualistic, very, sort of savoir-faire, just often in the ether of cultural theory, very divorced from ecological questions. So I'm wondering, do you see a disjunction between the units of analysis we're using and the theory you're proposing? And if so, what's the amount of work we have in front of us to go back and get these different units to make this work?
Yeah, I'm probably going to give you an unsatisfying answer, because I'm now, the whole time you're asking that question, I was going through every discussion I've had with you. So I'm just going to answer with a diminished version of Justin. But I think for some, that's goes back to having the right theory at hand to explain what we want to explain. And is behavioral ecology suited for asking questions about Middle Stone Age versus Later Stone Age? On its own, probably not. I think we need a few steps down the line if we can link certain ways of doing things with lithic artifacts to something like mobility, that we think, at least based on global scale data, is constrained by stuff like seasonality and availability of different resources. We may be able to. But a big, does behavioral ecology, is it perfectly suited to, old Acheulean transition? I don't think so. But maybe, we can draw from it to, put together models of how we think, what we think is actually important and what might lead to these technological changes. But I think there are other aspects of human behavior that are more tractable. Again, and this goes back to discussions you and I have had, so it's not new to you, but all right, we think we can get at mobility. We think there are good lithic proxies for that. Behavioral ecology dictates how mobility responds to the environment, so maybe we can. But the data may not always be out there. How do we get at mobility from lithic data? There's lots of ways of going about it. But does the name, if I have a data set that just says Middle Stone Age and Later Stone Age, I'm not sure I can actually give you what we want from that.
Right.
So that's a problem. But it goes to this. That's okay. I don't find it depressing that that's a problem. It's just, well, we need to do some more thinking up front if that's the kind of thing we want to explain, right? And it's there are behavioral ecology as is widely applied in archaeology. There's a lot of great stuff about foraging behavior. robust models and ways of operationalizing it, where I can literally make robust inferences from the types of data we readily collect and that are widely available. The lithic data, how far are people moving on the landscape? How are they, where are they going to source their raw materials? How much are they preparing it before they get to where they're going? Those are things we can probably get a handle on. But, for these broad, Little Stone Age writ broadly, there's a lot of variability going on there in terms of populations and how they're interacting. So I don't think we can just equate it to one single way of being a human.
Brian Stewart, while you're staring off, would you like to answer?
I'm trapped. I can't speak. Frozen. I ossified during the time. It was quite the opposite. It was really thought-provoking and very, very good, Justin. So thanks so much. Just to follow up what Justin and Tyler were just saying, behavioral ecology is indeed very promising and has been used to great effect, of course, especially in more recent periods where the data is very good, of course. But it presents something of a paradox. I'm sort of an advocate for it when it can be used, but you've got kind of a weird paradox because, behavioral ecologists have this kind of get out of jail free card, where their model often doesn't match, or at least predictions drawn from their models often don't match the archaeology, and then they sort of, and they'll tell you this. They sort of use the data and the patterns that they detect, how far that falls from the predictions they sort of use to gauge what they would say are more interesting behaviors. And they often sort of say, well, this is where more cultural sort of behaviors come in that are less explainable and deviate humans away from other animals. And so you've got this weird situation, thinking about kind of, these deep time scales where behavioral ecology could potentially be actually very cleanly applied to earlier portions of human time, of deeper time, because arguably people are doing things that are less likely to fall far away from the predictions. They're acting a bit more like other foraging animals in some way, and they're not taking in cultural concerns into a lot of their decision making. Of course they are, but I mean, in those higher level decisions that people are making on enculturated landscapes and about why they're picking up particular stone and not others. It's not all about just equations in their mind about efficiency. It's often, these are culturally dictated norms, and they follow, they often follow kind of arbitrary ideas in these more cultural systems. And as you move further back in time, you get away from that and you get more possibility potentially to kind of cleanly employ behavioral ecology. But at the same time, of course, then you get problems of preservation. To really apply behavioral ecology well, you really need good faunal assemblages. I think actually the lithics have turned out to be kind of a mess, and people have tried to correct that, Todd Zervel and others, to sort of mixed effect. Faunal assemblages are kind of the gold standard, and as you move further back in time, not only do you get less of that, but of course you get more conflated, more time averaged assemblages. And so even though earlier time periods sort of theoretically are better suited because you get kind of a not a lack of culture, but less extreme sort of cultural variability, but then you've got this preservational problem. Anyway, it's just sort of a thought, and sort of thinking about ideally what would be really nice is if you could sort of, get at at some of these moments where with behavioral ecology, the what you actually detect is actually, when that starts to fall, beyond the model, and use that as some sort of gauge for, for addressing the evolution of different sort of cultural, cultural events where people are becoming more, these things are starting to be selected for, and they're becoming more concerned with cultural norms and attitudes, and less concerned with pure adaptation and pure ecological constraint. But that's probably quite far off. But anyway, yeah, more of a comment and a muse.
Last question from Alex.
Hey, Tyler, that was a great talk and certainly very important for sort of the current themes within the field right now. So I'm tuning in from New York University as a PhD student, and one of my questions I will acknowledge up front will probably take us down sort of a rabbit hole even further. But what I love about this topic is bringing us back to the spatial temporal scales and how much that matters. That's always been a topic that I've enjoyed, because within archaeology, we have all sorts of different scales where we work with, right? There's the regional scale, there's a global scale. And so something that I recently chose to undertake as a term paper for one of my classes was actually looking at the African green periods, right? So that increase in humidity and then the onset of aridity afterwards, specifically affecting North Africa. And so something I noticed when, going through the literature and looking at that topic is, right, so when we're dealing with these wet dry phases in North Africa, we're really working with a scale that's not seasonal, right, which is really hard to extract from the archaeological record, but it's also not glacial, right? It's not these glacial phases that that basically take, they take time to onset and actually impact the environment in such a way that would cause sort of these turnover pulses. So I was just wondering your thoughts, if you have any, on, if we might ever be able to get enough, I guess, evidence extracted from cores or anything like that to actually get at how these African green periods during early hominin evolution, how they may have impacted sort of the environment and thus hominin evolution in North Africa, and if we can ever get at these smaller time scales that aren't sort of the glacial, interglacial phases.
Yeah, so I think this leads to, an interesting challenge is in certain parts of the world, especially, equatorial Africa, Northern Africa, precessional cycles are key. And so we're looking at change on the scale of 10,000 years, not 100,000 years or longer. And then we got this problem of not always, but a lot of the kinds of data we have access to are too coarse to record those fine scale cycles. Now there are exceptions, and sometimes maybe we can go out and try to target the kind of records that are going to give us that high resolution. But there's some cases where you don't have it. I'd love to be able to link, look at precessional cycles and large mammal species composition in Eastern Africa, but my data are too time average, the data sets that are available. They encompass multiple cycles. So what do you do there? One option is say, well, I don't have the data to hand to ask it. Maybe I should ask a different question. But I think in some cases, this is an area where I think that generative modeling that I mentioned briefly in the talk has some promise. Is we've been exploring it, myself and quite a few others in Southern Africa, but we have these situations where we have these time average data sets, and it's a time average record of hominin behavior, a time average environmental data set, and we're interested in stuff that plays out over finer time scales. Like, well, how do we get from short-term ecological or ethnographic scale observation to a 400,000 year packet of data? But some initial, playing around with the models is it can kind of dictate, hey, what are the patterns, even if I have really coarse data that is time averaged, more, across multiple precessional cycles. Are there aspects of my data that, let's just say it's time averaged faunas, just because that's what I like to think about all day. But are there aspects of community structure or composition that look different when I have, when it's time averaged under one kind of regime versus another, or across changing regimes? And it leads to, hey, maybe there are things that we could latch onto and try to pull apart. Maybe not, we can generate models and say, guess what? It's intractable with the data I have at hand. I can't tease apart a system where precession is really important versus not from the data I have at hand. I guess I got to get different data or ask a different question. So that's sort of, I think it's very relevant, and highlights a big challenge here. It's a lot of what we want to explain are based on short-term ecological or behavioral observations that play out in these time average records that aggregate all kinds of environmental variation. And they don't always align neatly with what we wish we could see. We got to figure out a way to work our way around it, or think about other problems that we can get at.
Thank you, Tyler. Thanks so much for the talk and discussion today. I'm just going to, I know we've pretty much run out of time, but I'm going to open up some breakout rooms on vegetation, archaeology, paleoclimate, and then also Southern Africa and Eastern Africa. So if there's any sort of coordination that we need to do within those, just jump into those. Yeah, let's see how it goes.
I'm not going to jump into. Is that me?
That is you.
Yeah.
Oh God.
Is that John Wayne?
It's me. I'm not going to jump into a breakout room, but I just wanted to try to ask you that following. I saw there's Berensmeyer equations for what we can extrapolate from palimpsests, basically faunal palimpsests. I was wondering, that's an interesting equation that could easily be applied in some ecological context, and I was wondering what you thought about applying them in cultural dimensions. If you've like sort of run through the mental arithmetic of doing that, and if it does present an easier challenge at some points, either open air sites or basin-based deposits versus rock shelters, different time periods, if we can more easily extrapolate like what a palimpsest in archaeology represents in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can. What I would do in that case is get, and it's actually what we're doing in our west coast of South Africa project, but with Ben Davies, who's a generative modeler. But like you could simulate different archaeological assemblages using a modeling approach that sample these different amounts of time. It's trickier. Well, it's trickier for me to conceptualize in terms of the lithic behavioral record, because I don't,
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't behave the same way as getting at species. But I think it is important, like, if we, there's a lot of literature in, Pleistocene environments inferred from, whatever proxy I have. And, you think about it in terms of this, here's hominin, Australopithecus hanging out in these trees, and all right, cool, this is what I want. And if only I can get better, measure every last tree and blade of grass, closer to that, real life reconstruction. But then it's like, well, wait a second, most of our data, that's impossible. We don't have that. I'm looking at sort of a regional scale aggregate of broadly what the environment looks like. It's got animals from all over the place. And I should mention like that Dew and Berensmeyer paper where they played that sort of time averaging game, that was based on the assumption, that's based on the environment is static.
Right.
You add changing environment to that, and it gets blows it out even more. And I think it probably would be important to think about those kind of things from a behavioral. All assemblages are not created equally. If you have a 1,000-year time average aggregate versus a 10,000-year time average aggregate. And that's probably even if the environment is stable over that entire 10,000 years. That's probably.
And it might be worth saying that, a 1,000-year time aggregate might be comparable to a 10,000 or 100,000-year time aggregate somewhere else that's in a completely different environmental context. It's not quite so close to an ecotone or is not as environmentally sensitive. So when comparing between different sites, it's something to keep in mind as well.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the easy predictions are for the archaeology, with faunal data, for example, there are aspects of the species abundance distribution that we expect to change in regular rays as you time average more. We pick up more and more rare taxa things even out as you start smearing the different environments. So like there are obvious ways of getting at that, but I think with a right thinking or the right modeling kind of approach, we could probably figure out, well, what does happen over Flim Blasquet, for example, over 1,000 years versus 10,000 years.
Yeah.
It's tricky though, because it's, you know, it's you can have time averaging, adding species, or you can have dietary breadth changing, and those things have to be picked apart. That's difficult, you know, to try to pull out what the formation process is from the human behavior at that scale is. It's difficult. I mean, obviously.
But so I don't know. I mean, I guess it looks like breakout rooms aren't happening.
Yeah, Rehab wants
I wanted to go to all of them, so it's like, well, I don't know.
I think we may don't really need them, but so
Yeah,
I'm going to cancel them. Close all.
I mean, I guess while
Bye-bye.
you know, the group is here, it's like what?
This is kind of a breakout room.
Yeah. What are our questions and
Rehab?
do we want to do with this?
Yes, actually, thanks, Taylor, for your very inclusive talk. That was quite insightful. And why I raised my hand is when I checked about the breakup rooms, and I see we have East African, we have South African, then we have the sub-themes vegetation and paleoclimate. And looking at the people who are present in the for this, we are few, and I was thinking that it might not work. That's why I was raising my hand.
No, and I just
but otherwise,
yeah,
because I see like from East Africa we are few who are, as in like we are very few, and everybody here would want to hear about.
And let's not break it up. Let's keep us all together to talk amongst us all. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's quite where we go ahead and discuss whatever it is within this room. And hi, everybody. It's nice.
Nice to hear you, Rehab.
Yes.
Hi.
Okay.
And then everybody leaves on that note.
I know a breakout room that I'm
going.
It's breakout room time where you are, Brian.
It's
Break
definitely
dance
breakout room time. I've only got a coffee in front of me, and it just seems wrong.
Yeah, I was wondering from the cultural side of things, if we need something akin to what Claudio Teni and colleagues have done for the sort of early Pleistocene record, a thinking exercise, right, of like resetting the null hypothesis for what causes cultural change or what patterns tell us about cultural differences. And their argument is, you know, there's a lot of criticism of it, but the basic argument is that, you know, that you have the sort of zone of latent solutions around humans. They can basically reinvent any strategy they want at varying degrees of fidelity, depending on how culturally dependent they are. And at the beginning of the Pleistocene, it's really banging sharp rocks together is something that's within the zone of latent solutions of all hominins. So anyone in close proximity with the need could pick it up and basically make the older one. And that really all that's driving that patterning in that time is just where the rocks are in the landscape and where the needs are distributed, which could be an ecological thing, right? So where a scavenged carcass might lie that requires a sharp flake to butcher it. But we've not really done that much for the later record. You know, even anything past like 2 million years, we then assume that, you know, culture's locked in and there's no such chance for sort of the reoccurrence of these techniques or strategies that characterize the archaeological record just by pure latent solutions. Like, oh, I know how to put these two things together, so I make a third thing. So you end up with these emergent properties. And I feel like we almost need something like that to sort of say, here's what we would expect if there is no copying, if there is no cultural trend being driven by the connectedness of groups intellectually, right? Which is what a lot of the ecological models are assuming, is that when climate creates similar selective pressures, humans are going to respond in similar ways because we're essentially sort of wired in the same way to respond to aridity similarly with similar toolkits. So that's why the Middle Stone Age changes uniformly across Africa, because we're all kind of thinking the same way, right? But how much of that is just convergent evolution, just chance, happenstance of putting two things together at the right time to come up with a Lavoie point? You know, the amount of times that happens around the world seems to be impossible that it's driven by a single climatic factor. But I'm sure some of them are, right? So how we need systems to pull those two things apart first, and then say, okay, well, here's like the residual stuff left, kind of Glenn Isaac's approach of like what is left that we can then mop up with an ecological hypothesis. You know, I'm not sure what folks think about that sort of approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, sort of similar, kind of the Middle Stone Age turn on aridity thing is it doesn't really work like that. It you know, again, that's so spatially heterogeneous, which is at the same time confounding, because you sort of want to, considering the scattered nature of the archaeological record, it'd be great if everything was sort of turning over at the same time in the same direction in the same way with the same results and the same sensitivity, so you could have a control to test against.
Right.
But it's not. And so, I mean, even, I was talking about some narrow, very fine, steep climatic gradients. But there's things, like Melissa, works around Lake Malawi and Tom as well. And, that's kind of this, it's a funky area. Comparing it with Southern Africa and East Africa, it's sort of all this stuff's coming out, which is like, that's doing different stuff on lots of different time scales. And as the forcings change, the response to kind of an external forcing will also be variable across the landscape. And then you run into this issue of what people like, because obviously it's not just wetter or drier, it's better in all cases. If you're in a very wet environment in rainforest, you'd love it to dry out. If you're in the Namib Desert, you really, really hope it doesn't dry out. So sort of finding that sweet spot in terms of resources, in terms of what people are actually pulled to or pushed from, I think is a very important consideration. But I guess one of the pluses is that, at least in Southern Africa, I kind of feel like we're moving towards a mechanistic model that we can interpolate between sites to some kind of a degree, and maybe have a moving control, have something which is spatially and temporally variable that is still useful, and not just really, really confusing. I'm not saying we're there yet, but I think that I think together there is room for a combined approach that, through a type of iterative process, you could probably actually, one can inform the other in a very useful way, which is, I think, something we should really chase down in the context of this. I mean, I know we were talking about it a bit before in one of the other meetings that we've had together at some point. Your basic premise of sort of like, let's go back to brass tacks and reset the null hypothesis, I think is something that's would be useful, kind of clean the slate and sort of keep in the good and throw out the bad, or at least recognize the bad for the bad, because that's very rarely done. I mean, how many people think that glacial periods were crap in Africa? Most. And that's really just not the way it is, at least in some places, so.
Yeah.
Justin, could you place that reference to the paper you were talking about, that early Pleistocene paper in the chat?
Yeah.
Useful.
Yeah,
I mean, because I also agree that I think that would be the thought exercise approach is a good idea. I mean, the problem is, I mean, again, not to be the Debbie Downer all the time, but those arguments in late Pleistocene Africa, I mean, in early Pleistocene Africa, as Tyler showed, are still ongoing, right? I mean, it's not like those have been solved and therefore we have a clean way forward. I mean, those are still active academic debates, but it would be really useful to see that. I hadn't seen that paper, so.
Yeah, and there's actually there's a new one. Quite a few people, I think, probably from the same research group. The sort of Tenny, Tübingen, Max Planck are sort of like zoning in on this. Jonathan Reeves just had one out where they're looking at how short-term movements of pounding implements by basically tool-using apes could essentially over generations create a record that's very patterned and reflective of long-term movement of raw material. It looks like it's people moving rock all over the landscape, but it's actually tiny little moves to food-rich components of landscapes. So there's this aspect of equifinality there that creates the illusion of long-distance cultural connection that is really just into little valleys connecting with each other, or opposite ends of streams or parts of mountain systems, which is, I think, another really good, interesting thinking exercise for us to do. Is like, what does it mean that the middle Stone Age of two adjacent regions looks the same when we know nothing about what's in between them? Which is often the case, and it's the problem we're facing, right? But we can sort of, using Tyler's suggestion of like this generative modeling, put agents in the landscape, see if we can get the same patterns just by actually people moving like hyper locally, and just doing that sequentially, right?
Was that what Jonathan did in his paper? I assume he did, because that's what he's about.
Yeah, exactly. That's what it is. Yeah.
And it highlights a cool thing. It's like, we still don't know what our data are supposed to look like.
Right.
Like if you just interpreted the empirical archaeological data at face value, here's what I think is, here's the process that I think is generating this. Again, sort of going about it as a post-hoc narrative, like you get it wrong. It's because those archaeological data, the proxies we're monitoring behave, they lead to emergent phenomena, time averaged over long amounts of time, that are not like super obvious in terms of what you may have expected to see.
Yeah, and I think in the Reeves model, I'll put that link in here now. I just shared the Claudio Teni one. They just play with some basic parameters like how many trees in the landscape, because that's a key aggregation factor for ape tool using, and then they just play with like how many fruits are on the tree, another known parameter that dictates nut cracking density. And you just start to see all the parameters start to change in interesting ways, and the record starts to form, right, in a way that actually looks very much like the older one. Even though they acknowledge that pounding tools are not the same as the flaked stuff that we find in that record, but it's a way to get going. And I think people have stayed away from that for the later record, because like we think culture is just this like huge driving factor that clearly dominates the landscape, that these models would become too complex. But I think there is some basic stuff we could start doing with it. And there are colleagues in Portugal who just did this with bipolar. They just tried to see, like, if you take all the bipolar occurrences throughout the record, like how many times does it just reoccur? And that sort of metadata approach shows that there's a lot of this reoccurrence going on throughout the record, even when culture is a big selective factor. And if we could eliminate some of that and say, well, okay, we're going to take bipolar out then, right? And just focus on the stuff that seems to be more driven by ecological changes or more sensitive to them. That might also help us to rely not so much on hunter-gatherer theory, which doesn't have any observations of stone tool using groups, right? It's actually biased by metal, plastics, wood, all this other stuff that actually has nothing to do with lithics. So we can maybe just use the record to derive new kinds of observations about hunter-gatherers rather than the theory, which can be problematic sometimes. But I'll show those papers now.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think again, this goes to the scale issues that Tyler was talking about. I mean, things like that are going to work very well at slightly larger scales. I mean, the point is, like, otherwise they become cautionary tales. I mean, you can see these iterative things. You can say, oh, well, this is just people going about the daily business, and you may have explained some interesting patterns and you've rejected some things, but it's then we need to get to the business of getting some, of explaining beyond that, I think. So, and that's where we need to build theory and be more sensitive about, and then look at these more high resolution data sets, probably, relatively close in time, nearer in time, to build off that. But I think as you're saying, like, these sort of first order stuff would be really, really useful to do some of these things. Yeah, that was a great paper, that bipolar one, by the way. I really enjoyed that, from Nico and Zhao.
Yeah, it's a good start. Yeah.